sharks.
All right. I don't know. Tim, do you have preferences, or should I choose?
I would say any of the VBS ones,
Any of the
or
V
all of them.
or all of
Go ahead,
them?
sure.
How about so this will be predict. How about Rishi? Could I choose you as one shark, and then maybe Randall? You want to be a shark? All right, and you get to choose which of these 1600s drawings of sharks you most identify with. So, so I'm Daniel Tawfik from Stanford, and Tim Cornell is working with me on this as well. And this is titled Using PICU Readmission Predictions to Inform Precision Care, which I realize now I probably could have added another buzzword or two in there if I really tried, but it is what it is. So here's kind of our standard PICU patient, just to kind of lay the groundwork. They have illness severity on the y-axis over time, and their trajectory sort of looks like this. They start out in the PICU, they require some intensive care interventions at some point, they transition to acute care, and then eventually they get good enough where they can go home to finish their recovery. The problem is it never actually looks like this. It really looks more like this. And really kind of all of our interventions that we have, most of our interventions, are trying to reduce severity of illness, speed up recovery, left shift this, or smooth out recovery and kind of prevent some of these bumps. And this bump right here, you can see how this could end up being a PICU readmission. If they've gone to acute care, they kind of worsen a little bit, they end up getting a PICU readmission. But what if, at this point, we could have a prediction model that can tell us either some strategies to help smooth out this recovery, to speed up this duration of recovery, or even just tell us, actually, you thought you were here, but you know what? You're actually here. Maybe it's okay to send this kid to the floor even earlier than you might have anticipated. And so we're going to talk about PICU readmissions today. And so PICU or pediatric cardiac ICU readmissions are a handful of studies out there just documenting them, anywhere from 4 to 14%. There are even a few smaller studies that have prevalence up in the 30s. And it's associated with worse outcomes. Double the length of stay, almost double the mortality. From some of the better studies that have looked at this, and then there are all sorts of other considerations for unit flow, staffing, resource utilization. It's a very resource-intensive thing to have a kid go to the floor and come back, not to mention the family concerns as well. And so kind of what we're aiming to do is something that would use trajectory-based predictions, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail as well, and then pair that with patient-level optimization problems that would be then based on kind of causal inference on this machine learning model that could help drive some clinical decision support, and then follow that up with an actual prospective intervention and measure the outcomes that we have on length of stay. So here's an outline of the three different aims. So first aim is to develop a patient-level prediction model for PICU readmissions. Fairly straightforward there. I don't remember who it was. Kurt, I think, was saying he wanted a low-hanging fruit from PDC. Here's your low-hanging fruit. Aim 2 would be to then estimate a personalized action reward for n potential interventions. I have 5 proposed here as well that could estimate kind of the benefit of performing any of these 5 interventions on the patient in reducing their risk of readmission. That's the reward there for the action. And then finally, actually doing a comparative effectiveness trial where we're comparing control group to a passive dashboard that's just displaying the prediction to one that actually has a recommendation attached to it, and seeing what the comparative effectiveness is on length of stay, PICU readmissions, and then a standardized readmission rate, which is just the observed to expected readmission ratio that's indexed for patient severity of illness. So a little more detail on AIM 1, this initial patient-level prediction model. So this is something that I'm anticipating would use all 10 currently PDC sites, the data that they have, with our train test split being kind of a longitudinal time-based one where the historical 80% is used for our training and our validation. Melissa is set. And then the 20% most recent would be our test set. I actually like the sort of hybrid approach that you mentioned today, where maybe we would keep one of the units completely in the test set as well, to maybe get a little bit better sense of how generalizable this would be to other units rather than just kind of longitudinally over time. Put a few kind of candidate algorithms here. This is something that is not set in stone yet. A lot of the prior work, which is mostly adult work, has really just been logistic regression with a handful of papers that have used something more sophisticated than that. But using some variable selection such as lasso with logistic regression would probably be the most interpretable. And then as we move down the line, it gets a little bit less interpretable, although these tree-based methods are getting more interpretable and actually are not quite as much of a black box, I think, as they used to be, although neural net is still very much a black box, at least to me. Taking that prediction model, then we would do this causal inference from machine learning, where we would actually estimate the causal effect of performing a variety of potential candidate interventions. The potential interventions would not be pre-specified a priori. They would be selected from the features that end up being predictive, but obviously just the modifiable ones, age and gender, are not going to be, potential targets for interventions. And then actually estimating the, readmission risk reduction in order to, sort of disentangle, some of the biases that we get in machine learning. In particular, there's a feature selection bias or regularization bias. We would use a double machine learning approach, a double debiased machine learning approach, which I won't get into. I could, definitely just write out all the equations just from the top of my head right now. Don't worry about it. But I'll spare you that. I'm kidding. I can't do that. But really, the goal of it is to actually perform some causal inference. And just in the last few years, there have been a lot of really good advances in our ability to do that. And then there would also be some potential unit-level interventions. These are mostly, I'm thinking of staffing interventions, kind of different methods of staffing or evaluating patients, with increased frequency. And then that optimization problem would actually be kind of a unit-wide optimization problem that could take place on a daily basis. And that then would lead us into AIM 3, which is where we would actually deploy these models after some silent deployment and testing, of course. But and we'd quantify just a passive dashboard versus the recommendation engine version on length of stay readmissions and the standardized readmission rate. And so this would be cluster randomized, where a third of the sites would be controlled. They would have no intervention. A third of them would just have a passive display, and a third of them would be actually the recommendation engine that actually recommends 1 to 2 interventions that could reduce risk according to the model by a pre-specified threshold. This is intended to be more of a reference than a roadblock, really, for people. So that's why I put that there. But that's sort of where we're going with that. The data sources, so this can all be done actually with what is currently in PDC: demographics, admission characteristics, diagnoses, procedures, physiologic trends, and interventions. I think it could actually be enhanced with some data that I believe are in VPS, but correct me if I'm wrong. Some of the things that PDC doesn't have is the specific day of week of discharge or the time of day of discharge. If those are available and able to be linked, I think that could actually improve our recommendations. There is one study that found time of day to be somewhat predictive of readmissions, although nothing that I could find that's actually looked at day of week. And then kind of unit-wide census, I think, could be relevant as well, and that may be something that could be extracted from VPS. Local, at least currently locally, although there's always potential for folding this into to PDC and kind of a future iteration of it. We've talked about audit logs, the care context, the team who's taking care of the patients. All of those are data that can be extracted from audit logs. They're not currently a part of PDC. They're somewhat challenging to work with, but I think at a local level, they could be done. And then other kind of staffing considerations, so nurse staffing, nursing ratios, both in the ICU and on the acute care floor, as well as RTs for respiratory patients and the physician team as well, I think could be kind of potential a secondary set of predictors. And that's what I had. I'm happy to take questions, comments, or smart remarks.
Which chart do you want to start?
Either way.
It was quite, I think, nice in terms of the vision that you showed, and I thought it was nicely presented. I think I think you have enough there for 3 R01s. Really, I think there's a lot of work in each of those. Each one of the aims that you presented, the derivation of the model, the retrospective validation of the model, the evaluation of, or the derivation of the causal inference models, the derivation of the dashboard, the evaluation of the dashboard. I think there's a lot of stuff that you can do that'll keep you very busy. But I'm just curious to see what you've, what was your thought process in terms of taking a discriminative approach in AIM-1 and then wanting to tie in causal interactions. What can you kind of go through how did you link them together, and what were you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, you're asking about kind of why did we go from AIM-1, which is just kind of generating a prediction model, to then doing something that's more in the decision support sort of range. Yeah, and I think really kind of the thought process behind it is that just predicting readmissions probably on its own isn't extremely valuable. I think like Tim was mentioning before, with mortality prediction, I think most of us, I don't have this quantified, but we probably feel we have a pretty decent idea when we send a kid out of the unit. Well, is this a slam dunk? Are they going to be fine on the floor? Or is this a kid that's kind of dicey? Wouldn't be surprised if I see him back here tomorrow morning. And so just predicting their risk of readmission, I'm not sure would really move the needle that much on our care. But if that can actually be linked with, okay, here's their current predicted risk, but if you were to do this one or maybe these two things, here's what would happen to their predicted risk, then that could actually be something that that I think could actually really kind of reduce length of stay without increasing readmission risk. You could sort of see two different payoffs here. One is reducing readmission risk with the same length of stay, or the other one is reducing length of stay with the same readmission risk, which probably the latter, I think, is the more likely outcome.
So why even do AIM-1? Like, what's the purpose of AIM-1?
The purpose of AIM-1 is to get to AIM-2, and it is a little bit linear there, and maybe they should just be, maybe they should be 1A and 1B.
No, I think you're onto you're onto a really important thought process, right? So if the goal is to make a useful recommendation system and not necessarily a simple naive predictive system, then focus all of your effort on developing the recommendation system. That's, I think, where the real leverage is, and that's a hard problem to model, because all you have access to is observational data. Right. You don't have access to any experimental data.
Right.
So the questions that you have from a graphical based causal inference approaches is how do you construct the questions and construct the scenarios to ask what are the variables that are likely contributing to readmissions? And those, you could construct 3 very large experiments on just those. So I would suggest, focus on AIM-2, build it out. I think it's really important, and you'll probably have a lot to do in that AIM before you get to evaluating and doing all that. I think if you focus on that, this will be very compelling.
How do you then control for disease progression? Because one of the reasons we have bounce backs is disease progression. Kid is perfectly fine, got his seizures under control. They go out to the floor, and a day later they have a new seizure. No way to predict that. So I guess the value for me of the prediction model is it adds that disease into it. And it says, this kid has a seizure. The best we're going to get with seizures is 90% or whatever it is. Do you need that before you go on to because that the ability to predict is limited by disease. Do you need that to go on to suggesting your interventions?
I think those all need to be tested, right? I think all of those need to be bundled into AIM-2 to see, do you need to have multiple single tests? And then put each of those tests as a node on a graph and see what the coefficients are, the positive and negative reinforcements are, and then you'll have it. I think you can do a lot in AIM-2, and that's the exciting part.
I was wondering how much your returns have been in the last year, and what was the income from your sales units per?
You can have 10% authorship for $1 million. That's my, yeah.
And if you'll come in with me,
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take the contrarian view. I wouldn't waste your time on AIM number 2 because causal inference is a lost cause anyway, especially with the sort of data we have. So I'd tell you to get a. Didn't mean to horrify you, Melissa. I would be interested in exploring, instead of being complex about this, an expert panel of what we think are the reasons for readmission. And I'd do an assessment of the physiologic state prior to discharge, as well as, which isn't going to be normal. And I don't know if closer to normal or closer to discharge state is good to know, but that's easy to test in retrospective data without these big, massive experiments. I think it's something we all want to know, and certainly it's appealing. Readmission rates still seem to attract CMS interest, and they certainly attract hospital interest. I also think that we know some of the causes, that the physiology disease progression one, but I think census has a lot to do with it, and I think we have that data. Time of day, we also know that one. So I think to be able to improve this, first of all, describe the problem. So I do agree, do AIM-1 first, and then see if we have data to look for causes we've already measured. Or, sorry, I can't believe I said causes after shooting down causal inference. Relationships we've already identified. Yes, Melissa. Oh, sorry.
Sure. Ask a question real quick.
I have no idea to clinicians. Are all readmissions equal? I'm not sure what I mean.
No.
Okay. No. So, okay. Okay. So that was my main thing. And the other one, so when you say make a prediction, when are you making the prediction? And I also am trying to understand AIM-2. So an action reward for intervention. So if you're trying to predict the risk of readmission, so is the intent of AIM-2 interventions to reduce that predicted risk of readmission? Okay.
Yeah.
Those were the two
Yeah,
things
and
for me.
I think you asked kind of when are we making the prediction? Was that yeah? And so what most groups have done is tried to base their predictions on. One group has done kind of on PICU or on ICU admission. It was an adult, but most of them are kind of 24 hours before ICU discharge is when they're trying to predict the risk of readmission. And so I think kind of a 24-hour prior model and actually an at the time of discharge model would probably get maybe a little bit better at Randall's question. But the 24-hour would be more useful because predicting their readmission risk when you've already told the family and put in the bed request is going to be a lot less useful, I think. But
So my comment is to bring back to a comment that Randall made, because this is an important philosophical thing about our field, which is the idea of causal inference analysis. Because I learned from Randall that we do thousands of natural experiments and we're not learning from them. And the natural experiment, if you're learning from them, is to have some causal inference of what works and what doesn't work. And you also mentioned like getting an expert panel to. So no. Let's go back to the data. All right. So my question is, how many do we think it's a lost cause to do causal inference on observational data? Is this where we are right now? But it doesn't work, even though there may be some nuggets of gold in the data that we collected historically in our patients of what works and doesn't work.
Can someone define for me exactly what you mean by that?
So causal inference is the idea that you can. So the problem with observational data is that the patients receive treatments or receive actions in a context, right? And the context results in a selection bias, right? You don't give steroids to every kid. You don't intubate every child. You don't give them, Yeah. So the idea of causal inference is can you, using causal inference techniques, which there are many propensity scores and causal forests and all these other techniques to do causal inference, can you use this approaches to account for the selection bias so that you're comparing historic data apples to apples to say which intervention helped the patient the most? So can you find this idea of digital twins at their same, the digital twins in the sense of two patients who are exactly the same, digitally at least, at the same time point in their disease course, one of who received treatment A and the other one did not receive treatment A or received treatment B, and you can do that with enough patients that you can start establishing the relationship between the effects of that treatment and the outcome of those patients, and start doing some inference on the causal influence of that treatment. And that can inform, obviously, prospective clinical trials and things like that. But if we as a field say, oh, well, causal inference doesn't work, then we should stop looking for those kind of analysis in historic data. That changes the game for many of us who are trying to do that. I don't know. Jen probably has a comment there.
Can you go back to one of your very first slides with that trajectory with PICU, floor? So the, and I don't know how the rest of you are, what the rest of the hospitals you're in are like, but we've had a hell of a time getting kids to the floor. And so I've done more discharge summaries in the last 3 weeks than I've done in my entire career. And so I wonder if rather than, so what's cool up here is if what you could do is predict the time when discharge without a readmission was really going to take place. And what I'd like to know, because I'm looking at the OR list and there's 4 kids coming out of the OR and I've got a unit that's full, and I've got 3 docs telling me, oh no, they can't go home or they can't go to the floor because they're too sick. I would love to look at these people and say, just get off my case. The kid's going to be out tomorrow. We're going to start all these cases and everything's going to be fine. So I view what you're trying to do not necessarily as trying to accurately predict who's going to bounce back, but this would be a great way to predict what your census is going to be like a day out or 2 days out or a week out, and frankly, given what the census on the floor is, who's then you're going to hang on until they go home.
That's the exact reason I told him to do this grant.
We-
We had kids in the ICU, And it's like, I know this kid won't bounce back. And so let's get him moving. Let's push him through. And because really that's the advantage of knowing who might bounce back, right? Where they are on this trajectory. So that's the whole impetus for this is how do we efficiently get kids safely flowing through our system.
Stephanie, I'll feed you back.
This is awesome. Thank you. So we've done some work in recurrent arrest, and what we found is that like some kids have an arrest in 24 hours or 48 hours, and then some it's weeks and weeks later. And your interventions for those kids are going to be different. Like the resource utilization for a kid who's going to bounce back in a week would be quite different than the kid that comes the next day, and you saved a week of ICU days. So I was curious about if you have an idea of how you would sort of account for those sorts of things, or the kids who are going to bounce back and have a bad outcome associated with that, rather than the kids that come back for a day and leave.
Yeah. I don't think I would try to predict a readmission more than a week out. I think. And most of the literature, I think, would support, beyond 7 days, like that's kind of beyond the range. For hospital readmissions, it's usually like 30 days, but for ICU readmissions, anywhere from 24 to 48 hours to a 7-day window. But I don't think I would be reaching beyond that 7-day window to define it as a readmission that we're trying to prevent. But yeah, I've had kids that have planned readmissions. I know they're going to go to the OR in 2 or 3 days and have to come back to the PICU. And in those cases, I'll send them to the floor because, hey, that's 2 days less of, being in the ICU. That's kind of a different question as unplanned versus planned readmissions, but yeah.
So one of the things that I was thinking about as you were presenting this is we're talking a lot about census and have been talking a lot about that today in staffing, is also considering not just PICU level census, but like floor level census, what unit they're going to on the floor, right? A patient with bronchiolitis that's going to a surgical unit that doesn't see bronchiolitis very often is, in my mind, is probably going to have a higher risk of bouncing back, at least anecdotally, what I've seen. And so I think that for me is one of the big pieces that's missing here are those floor factors that you can know up front when you're doing your model and trying to take account for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's stuff that's not currently in the PDC, but locally places have it, and in theory it could be added into the PDC. And we'll also have patients not infrequently who don't need critical care nursing, they just need more frequent nursing than a 4-to-1 ratio on the floor can do. And I don't know about other hospitals, but ours, if they're on the floor, it's 4-to-1. There's no 2-to-1 nursing on the floor, even if it's acute care level of nursing.
Daniel, can you go to your next slide? So I want to just suggest that this slide illustrates the problem of causal inference from observational data, because
this part,
the implication is that actually being readmitted caused an increase of mortality, but in fact, it's a selection. The kid didn't stay out. And so it's a different population. And I think this is exactly why the causal inference thing is problematic, because what you could do if you wanted to have a randomized trial is you could say that if my predicted risk of readmission is over a certain threshold, I don't discharge them. Or I do discharge them anyway. It's randomized. Now, you're never going to do that trial. But the problem is that I think if you put this into your significance, you're going to lose the reviewers because they're going to say it's baloney. It was a sicker patient, or he was going to die anyway. So I think
that's true. These are adjusted, but no adjustment is perfect.
Well, yeah. They're not adjusted for causality. They're simply relationships, and
they're
I think
just
that's really
for the severity markers we measure. Yeah, that's true.
A couple more questions, and then we go to a break. Otherwise, people are gonna.
A couple thoughts. So first of all, I would posit that the goal should not be 0% readmissions.
Right. Yep. I agree.
The reasons that they are obvious to you. Number two, when you're looking at ICU census, I would look at it not just at that moment, but also sort of future ICU census, because you might be sending that kid out because you have the 4 ORs coming out, so you're just trying to free up space.
Makes sense, yeah.
I think that the differences between centers and the differences even just like that particular day is going to be really, really cumbersome. But I also think you might want to look at this in a slightly different thing. So like you said, we're pretty good, or at least we think we're pretty good about like when I'm sending little Billy out, like I'm pretty sure he's going to be fine, or like, you know, this is dicey, but like I'd have no choice. But what we probably suck at a lot is realizing that Timmy next door is actually a better candidate, and maybe I should be pushing him out. So maybe rather than trying to predict readmission at the time we're going to send them out anyway, identify the patients that are actually ready to go to the floor. It's almost like ERTs, right? Like, so you're not trying to do it at the time you're going to extubate anyway. You're trying to kind of like force the kid along a little bit, and that maybe you might get some more traction on.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and that's that's a standard part of our sign out when we're high census is this kid's not ready to go to the floor, but if you have to, send this one, not that one, and actually putting some data behind that. Yeah.
Please consider, I think there's an important strata of patients in your study, and it's the kids with the most complex chronic conditions. And the data is there, I think, and the concern is, do those patients get discharged to home instead of the floor, because the care at home or the ICU is superior to the floor, just it is. And that could be, actually could be one of the interventions potentially. And that's a pretty good size group, and the data for discharge from the ICU to home or to the floor, I think should be there.
Yeah, we should have that, and we should be able to calculate their ICU readmission, whether they went home in the interim or whether they, came straight back from a floor. Yeah.
I think this is pretty interesting, and I think the group's already brought some of these issues back to you. What I would say is, before you get too far, you ought to go to the VPS and actually look at what this readmission rate is for unplanned admissions. It's probably less than 0.5% within 24 to 48 hours.
Okay.
And when you start looking at the reasons they come back, most of those are for a problem that wasn't identified in the PICU or not present at the time they left. But I think the numbers that are up there, I don't know the background on those numbers, but out of 130 PICUs, those readmission rates within 24 hours or 48 hours, and we have it, we could go out farther than that if you want it, but I would say you might want to just start there and get a better handle on what kind of numbers you're looking at, Dan.
Okay. Yeah, some of these are 7-day readmissions,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't expect them to be that much higher than if the 2-day is 0.5%.
I don't know that.
Yeah.
I don't know the
Okay.
filters that they have up there.
Okay. Yeah, these are unplanned readmissions. I think there are a couple that didn't differentiate between planned and unplanned.
Yeah. I would posit there are many more kids that are staying too long in the ICU than the ones that get bound. So maybe we focus on.
Which I think a goal can be reducing length of stay
yes.
just without increasing readmissions.
So let's take a break, get up, move around,